The plates are on the table, there's something on the hob that's been there for the last hour, and the kitchen smells like it always smelled at Nan's house. Something you can't name but would recognise anywhere. 10 meals are on this list. Not restaurant food, not pub food. Nan's food. Here's what happened to all of them. A cast iron pan, a knob of lard, and slices of lamb's liver going in while the onions were still softening. Nan knew exactly how long to cook liver. Long enough to be safe, short enough to stay tender, which is a narrower window than most people appreciate. Done wrong, it turns to rubber. Done right, it is one of the most intensely flavourful things you can put on a plate, especially under a thick onion gravy with mashed potato on the side. This was a weeknight staple through the 1950s, 60s and 70s, eaten for its economy as much as its taste. Liver was one of the cheapest cuts at the butcher, and it was filling. Two things changed. Supermarkets stopped displaying offal prominently, and a generation grew up not knowing how to cook it. Now, even the butchers who stock it will tell you that most of their customers for liver are over 60. A tin of corned beef, 3 or 4 potatoes, 1 onion, a frying pan, and something approaching 20 minutes. That was the whole recipe. The corned beef was broken up and fried with diced potato and onion until the edges went crispy, and the whole thing had that particular golden brown crust that only comes from leaving it alone long enough, topped with a fried egg, runny yolk. Nan made this when there was nothing in, which tells you something about how much she could produce from very little. The dish has its roots in the Second World War, when tinned corned beef from Argentina was a reliable protein source during rationing, and the habit of keeping a tin in the cupboard outlasted rationing by decades. It is still makeable. The tins are still on the shelf. Nan could make a meal out of nothing in 20 minutes flat. Most people under 50 have never had to learn how, which is either progress or loss depending on how hungry you've ever actually been. Spam arrived in Britain in 1941 as part of the American Lend-Lease Agreement, and by the end of the war it had found its way into the British working-class kitchen and stayed there. Nan's version was simple: slices of spam dipped in a batter of flour, egg and milk, fried in oil until golden, served with chips and baked beans or bread and butter. It appeared on school dinner menus throughout the 1950s, 60s and 70s. It appeared on Nan's table with a frequency that suggested she trusted it in a way she didn't entirely trust the alternatives. By the 1980s, spam had acquired a reputation for being low-quality processed food, which it is technically, but so is most of what fills a supermarket aisle, and the fritter went with it. The word spam is now more associated with unwanted email than with anything edible, which is a strange fate for something that fed a generation. Stale bread, and it had to be stale, the older the better. Buttered and layered in a dish with sultanas between the layers, then covered with a custard of eggs, milk, sugar, and a grating of nutmeg, and baked in a low oven until the custard had set and the top layer of bread had turned golden and slightly caramelized at the crusts. Nan made this because wasting bread was not something she did. The pudding existed specifically to use what was going stale, which meant it was made regularly, and with whatever bread happened to be available. The modern version has become a restaurant staple. You will find bread and butter pudding on pub menus done with brioche and Baileys and served in individual ramekins. But that version has almost no relationship to Nan's, which was made in a rectangular dish and served in squares and got better cold the next day. Not extinct, just unrecognisable. Pudding rice, full-fat milk, sugar, a generous grating of nutmeg, and about 2 hours in a low oven. The skin that formed on top, thick, golden brown, slightly rubbery around the edges and yielding in the middle, was the thing that divided the room. Some people ate around it, some people went straight for it. Nan had an opinion about which was correct and made it clear without being asked. A spoonful of jam stirred in, strawberry usually, sometimes raspberry, was the standard finish. This was not a quick pudding. It required the oven to be on for most of the afternoon and someone to check it periodically and make sure the skin wasn't burning at the edges. The combination of that time requirement and the availability of tinned and chilled ready-made versions ended the habit in most households by the 1990s. Ambrosia creamed rice kept the memory alive in a tin, which is not quite the same thing, and everyone who had the original version will tell you so without being asked. Warm semolina, ground durum wheat, cooked slowly in milk with sugar until thick and smooth, was served in schools and homes throughout Britain from the 1940s well into the 80s, usually with a swirl of jam through the middle, or a blob of it on top that you stirred in yourself. It is warm and mild and slightly grainy, and deeply comforting in the way that things with no strong flavour are sometimes more comforting than things that have been worked at. It has almost entirely disappeared from the British table, which happened partly because school dinner menus changed, and partly because the generation that grew up eating it didn't pass the habit on. It requires no special skill to make, and no unusual ingredients. The Semolina packet is still on the supermarket shelf, exactly where it's always been, waiting for a generation that has simply stopped reaching for it. Not discontinued, not unfashionable, just quietly unmade. Warm milk, a tablet of rennet, a little sugar, and patience. That is Junket. The rennet causes the milk to set gently into a soft, wobbly, barely there curd. More delicate than panna cotta, less assertive than blancmange, somewhere between a set milk and a very light pudding. It was served at room temperature or slightly chilled, sometimes with cream, sometimes with a dusting of nutmeg. It appears in British cookbooks going back centuries and was considered a gentle food, suitable for invalids and children, and anyone who needed something easy to digest. It fell from use as rennet tablets became harder to find. Most supermarkets stopped stocking them by the 1990s, and as the idea of a pudding that required no baking and produced something that wobbled and tasted mainly of milk became difficult to justify to children raised on Angel Delight. Junket is now so obscure that most people under 40 have not heard of it. A few specialist food shops still sell rennet tablets. The recipe takes 10 minutes. Nobody makes it. Nan made faggots from scratch, which means she started with the parts of the pig that most people now prefer not to think about. Liver, heart, lungs, mixed with breadcrumbs, herbs, onion, and bound in caul fat, the lacy membrane from around the pig's stomach. Formed into balls and baked until the outside was golden and the inside was dense and yielding. Served with proper mushy peas, not the tinned kind, though the tinned kind was used in a pinch, and a dark, thick onion gravy. This was a Midlands and Welsh staple, made from the parts that nobody else wanted, because waste was not an option. The knowledge of how to make them from scratch, and specifically the knowledge of where to source the raw materials, has largely left the domestic kitchen. Frozen versions from the supermarket exist and are not terrible. They are also not faggots, in the sense that Nan would have understood the word. Sausages laid in a roasting tin, fat rendered down, batter poured over, and in they went at high heat until the Yorkshire pudding had risen dramatically around and above the sausages, and the whole thing had to be navigated out of the oven without deflating it, which was its own particular skill. Toad in the hole technically still exists. It appears on pub menus, it is made in homes, it has not vanished. But Nan's version was different in one specific way. She used the sausages she got from the butcher, which were a particular kind of fat, coarsely ground sausage that shrinks less and has more flavour than the supermarket variety, and she cooked it in a tin that had been used for this purpose for 30 years and was seasoned accordingly. The dish is the same. The accumulated knowledge of the specific tin, the specific sausage, and the specific oven is gone, and that knowledge was what made it what it was. Not bread and butter pudding. Bread pudding. The dense, dark, spiced slab that came out of the oven looking like something structural. Stale bread soaked in water, squeezed out, mixed with suet or butter, dried fruit, sugar, mixed spice, eggs, and milk, packed into a greased tin and baked low and slow for the best part of 2 hours until it had set firm enough to cut into squares. Served warm as a pudding, or cold as a slab you carried in your hand. It was sold from bakeries by weight, well into the 1980s, wrapped in greaseproof paper, heavier than it looked. It is still made in some bakeries in the north of England, and it is occasionally found on market stalls. It is almost never made at home anymore, which is partly because the recipe requires a large quantity of stale bread, and partly because producing something this dense and dark and unfashionable feels like an act of genuine stubbornness in the current food landscape, which is exactly why it deserves to be on this list. That is 10. None of them are complicated, none of them require ingredients you couldn't find. What they require is the knowledge of someone who made them regularly, who knew the pan and the oven and the timing by feel, and who never wrote any of it down because writing it down would have suggested it needed explaining. That knowledge is what is disappearing. The recipes are the easy part. Tell me in the comments, which of these did your Nan make, and more importantly, did anyone ever actually teach you how? If you've got the recipe in your hands rather than just the memory, you're one of the lucky ones. If you found this worth your time, subscribing helps me know there's interest in these topics.